existence. In the case of Facebook, as you know, tens of millions of Facebook profiles were given, in effect, to third parties. There may be many more involved than we even know now, without the consent of those people who were Facebook users. Now look at the governance of Facebook, and you'll see that it's not a one share, one vote company. It's a company where the CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, has 10 votes per share. For each share, there are 10 votes. So that at the end of the day, he and a cohort of insiders control 68% of the votes in the company. Now that means only one thing, which is that there's really only one person in charge. There really is no accountability. The board itself, think about the board, not only is it not a board of independent people, but think about the fact that Facebook has 2.2 billion customers. The largest market is not the United States. The largest market is the European Union. Another large market is India and Brazil. The United States is one of those large markets, but the others are actually bigger. Anybody want to guess how many non-US board members there are on the Facebook board? 0, correct. So you see, in many different ways, this is a board that is disconnected from the customers, from the employees, from those who are involved in the company as advertisers. So you have a very disconnected board. Now, when Facebook faced this crisis in the last month, you could see that the way it responded was inadequate. It didn't respond immediately. It took days and days for the top executives to go before the public and explain what had happened. Even when they did, it wasn't particularly convincing. Even still, we find that the trust levels have plummeted in Facebook. So, and not only that, but the stock price has plunged by 20% since this crisis arose. Now, what did the corporate governance indexes tell you beforehand about Facebook? Well, if you look at MSCI, Facebook had received a D score. Now, what this means is that if you're a stakeholder and you looked at that, this would have given you an early warning or at least an insight into the potential risks of the company. Again, not about compliance. It's really about, in this case, whether the company is sustainable, whether it is a company that is going to continue to produce high performance. Now quickly look at Starbucks, facing a very different but also a tough crisis, which broke out simply, just a week ago, when customer filmed a Starbucks employee treating a black customer in a way that appeared to be discriminatory. This was sent to or seen by 10 million people on Twitter within hours. The video was seen by 10 million people. Now, Starbucks has 1 vote per share, even though there's and they split their chair and CEO, and it is widely held, and they have a relatively high mark, a B, by MSCI, and they responded quickly. Within 2 days, the company responded very forcefully, and as you may have known, they've just announced that on May 29th, they're closing every Starbucks store in America. That's more than 8,000 stores, to do racial sensitivity training, customer training for all their employees. Now, and by the way, their stock price only went down. It did take a hit, but only about 5%. So I raise this because it shows you that there are different ways to look at ratings, corporate governance indexes, and one of the things that they do is to give you an insight into whether companies are going to be successful and whether they have high risk or not. This leads to another question. Who uses indexes today? Now, when I actually started an index company back in 2000 with a few other people, and we were way ahead of our time. And I say that ruefully because essentially we didn't do very well. I mean, there were very few people wanted to buy the indexes that we were putting out. But today, this is very different. Actually, MSCI bought ultimately what we had produced, and now it's a very popular and commercially successful product. But if you think about today, it's not just a handful of people that are using indexes. I'll just give you a quick sense of who the users are. We have regulators, because the regulators want to know about compliance and whether companies are obeying the law. We have stock exchanges. Stock exchanges also want compliance because they have listing rules, but they're also looking for capital. They want more companies, they want more investors, and so they're particularly interested, and some have actually started their own sets of indexes. Asset managers want indexes because it helps them figure out not just which companies to buy and sell, because these indexes give them an insight onto risk, but it also helps them figure out, once they are invested in a company, if there is a high-risk company, they can figure out, okay, that I'm going to target for engagement or for proxy voting. So investors are very interested in indexes. Companies want indexes too, partly because if they are doing a good job in governance, an index will allow them to make it obvious. It's a comparator that they can use to demonstrate that they have converted governance into an asset. There are also market promotion agencies that want money coming into a market. I think of Paris Europlace, for instance, in France, or other places that they like to have indexes because it profiles the country and helps attract investment. Credit rating agencies. I know the list is going on and on. I apologize. Credit rating agencies want indexes because they give a sense, again, about the credit risk. Governance today is part of credit risk, and that's why the agencies really want them. Insurance companies want governance and indexes because it helps them craft D&O, or director and officer, insurance. If a company rates well on a governance index, it may be able to get better rates in insurance. Index providers want indexes because it helps them figure out the sort of index they can put together. They can put together an index of companies that are just rated well in corporate governance, for instance. And we have some of those examples around the world. NGOs, they are a big new player in corporate governance. They like it because they can figure out which companies they want to target for criticism, whether it's on climate change or executive pay. And search firms want criteria for corporate governance because it helps them figure out where to steer good board members, or what companies need good board members, and which are not so concerned about that. And finally, coming from an academic world, I can assure you, academics love indexes. The more data, the better. But then who provides the indexes around the world? Obviously, the number is growing exponentially. Al-Faisal is an important one in this part of the world. But there are others. Stellenbosch University is doing that in South Africa. Anuak is doing that in Mexico. So universities are a critical player. And by the way, they're important because they're trustworthy. They don't have other interests involved. So it's really important when a university takes this on. But there are a lot of other providers. Some of them are commercial advisors. And I'm not going to go through these, but just to give you a sense, some of these are commercial providers. Some of these are from financial information companies, such as, say, a Bloomberg or a Thomson Reuters. Some of them are from, for other types of agencies, such as nonprofits, Vigio and Iris I mentioned here. Some of them are investor related. Some are stock exchanges, as I mentioned earlier. The Novo Mercado in Brazil does this. Some are magazines and newspapers. Corporate Knights is one in Toronto that rates companies, and their particular focus happens to be on executive compensation. And then, of course, once you figure out who's doing it, you probably want to know what on earth are they assessing. And we, of course, heard Dr. Najati do a description of how Al-Faisal is doing that. But the fact is, this is something that requires some hard judgment calls. And the reason is because we don't have a consensus, whether it's in the academic world or the business world, about exactly what are the most important factors. Which is the factor in governance that will drive performance? Or which will be the one that reduces risk the most? So you need some real analysis. It's something that has got to be evidence-based, as Dr. Najati mentioned earlier, and it can't really be completely automated. Some things might be automated, but at the end of the day, this is a labor-intensive and a mind-intensive exercise. But you can't underestimate the fact that there are judgment calls to be made. And I wouldn't say that one is better than the other, but there are different ways in which providers look at these indexes. Some, for example, will only look at what we might traditionally call governance criteria. Some will look at environmental, we know the term ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Some will just look at the G, governance. Others will really emphasize the E, environment. Others will emphasize the S, or social. You have to decide what are the weightings you might give to each of those. You also have to decide, are you going to benchmark this against a local code only, or do you want to look at also international codes that may affect it? Or do you want to do it all from scratch with your own metrics? You have to decide which geography you're going to cover. Is it just the kingdom? Is it the GCC? Is it MENA, for example? All sorts of issues need to be addressed. Do you look just at the parent company, or do you look at subsidiaries? Do you look at supply chain companies? I mentioned Marks and Spencer and the Rana Plaza disaster. Do you look at all the supply chain companies that affect a company? So these are all critical factors, but they require a judgment call as to how an index is going to take them into account. This just gives you an idea of what the main categories might be. And again, I won't go through these, but this just gives you a quick sense. And here is an example, and I'm not going to ask you to try to read that unless you have extremely good eyeglasses. But just to give you a picture of what a typical report might look like from one provider, which is MSCI, and it will show you, actually you might be able to see that there are red flags in part of it, so that will, obviously that's how they red flag certain characteristics of the company, and those lines, that graph gives you a sense as how the company has performed on their own ratings over time. And they even do a rating as to, first, how does the company perform on against domestic companies and also against a global standard. But again, just to give you a sense about the judgment calls and the different ways in which indexes arise, I'm going to quick throw up on the screen 3 reports from 3 very different providers, all on one company. The company was ArcelorMittal, the steel company. This is a report from MSCI. Now, MSCI, again, don't even try to read it. It's really not going to be possible. But MSCI is really focused on the governance, the G. And that's going to give you one sense about how ArcelorMittal stacks up. This is Sustainalytics. They will look at the same company with slightly different information, and their focus is really on environmental performance. And Vigeo is one out of Paris. It's Vigeo Iris. Started originally as a firm from within the trade union movement. So their concern is, as you might expect, how companies treat personnel and labor. So very, very different kinds of ways of looking at the company. And of course, once you decide what your metrics are and how you're going, or rather, what you're going to cover, you have to figure out how you're going to do that. And that is just as tricky as making decisions about what, because the how depends on what information can you get. Now, sometimes you can ask companies, you can have proprietary questions, and part of that is how we did, how Faisal has done this. But also, you want to look at what what information is available publicly. You want to decide about whether you're looking at one market. You want to decide about training staff to analyze the material that you're getting. That's not so easy too, because sometimes you've got people doing the number crunching that they may not know governance, and you're going to have to train them on how to